Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, our co-host. Daniel, good to see you this morning.
Happy Monday, Dr. Paul. How are you?
I am doing well.
Good.
And I'm ready and raring to go to pretend that we're contributing to saving the world, but we can be convinced we're making an effort. We know that, and hopefully making a difference. But they tell me, and I understand the whole argument that you don't know if you're being effective or not. And the people who pretend that they say one thing and do something next day, we just saved the world, they're kidding themselves. But anyway, we believe that from this program that we're trying to get the honest information out, in particular on foreign policy. And today we came across some articles that actually are very accurate, saying some of the things we've been saying all along, but even more pertinent and maybe a little stronger. And of course, there was a couple articles on zero hedge, and I think that these are important. They quoted
Pasovich,
yeah, and he's really good on this stuff.
Oh, yeah.
But the one thing is, there's a lot of fallacies out there, and the theme, of course, of our program today is that the use of terrorism is exaggerated, and terrorism caused all these wars, and nothing changes no matter what we hear or how many wars we win or how many we lose. It's always a great victory. We're spreading American goodness. It's all necessary for national security, and it's all necessary to stop the terrorists. So it's the same arguments over and over again. But I think the impression I got from this is that that sometimes when we acknowledge something and say, this is good, moving in the right direction, I think what he's saying, look more closely. He doesn't say that directly at us, but he's urging people to look more closely, because even with these victories for our side, we're going to bring troops home. It never happens. We've been frustrated with that all along. But the whole thing is dissecting this out, trying to figure out what our policy is, why it's wrong, and in this case, why they are using, the excuse of terrorism for almost anything. And all I can remember is the argument we used when we were talking about going into Iraq is that we declared war against terrorism. Well, the point was made that terrorism is a tactic. You don't declare war against a tactic. You could be, and that probably led to the consequence. We never knew who the enemy was. We never knew it was over, and we keep fighting it. And terrorism is going to be around forever, even domestically. If somebody shoots up a school, well, maybe it's terrorism, and this sort of thing. So it is used as an excuse, unfortunately, and rightfully so. It's a problem when these attacks occur. But deception and lying and an excuse to spend more money and commit to a foreign policy that, instead of diminishing the threat of terrorism, I see it actually making things worse.
Yeah, and the thing that really caught our attention today, and hence our headline and such, is a piece we noticed on Common Dreams, which is a good website. And we've talked about this before, but this is Brown University's Watson Institute. And they do a thing called the Cost of War Project, where they have been tracking meticulously, objectively, the cost in money and lives of the post-9/11 U.S. wars. The latest report is called The Human Cost of Post-9/11 Wars, and there is a companion report, U.S. Budgetary Costs and Obligations of Post-9/11 Wars through fiscal year 2020. And the results, Dr. Paul, are pretty bad. We both noticed them. And it's really, this war on terror has morphed into a war on anyone we don't like. We just strike out everywhere. But Professor Catherine Lutz, who's one of the authors of the report, she comes out and says that they've noticed that they've been able to track the civilian death toll, 335,745 people, which sounds really bad, but that's only the tip of the iceberg, because it doesn't include the indirect deaths from these wars. Lack of food, lack of water, lack of infrastructure, or related diseases. So you add those in, you've got all the cholera issues, the starvation issues in Yemen. So the indirect deaths push that number higher, and it's really an astronomical number, likely to reach by the end of fiscal year 2020 3.1 million or more dead in the wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Pakistan, and Yemen.
But they also talk about this 800,000 people
Yeah.
being killed, but I think they put everything together. Obviously, it's way, way too much. And I think there is a difference between the American people who don't see body bags. They don't see as many people getting killed. But it is still ongoing, and there's no signs that this is going to end. And they use this, you know, to perpetuate some special interests, you know, whether it's the budget. The budget is coming up, and you know they're going to pass it out. No matter how much they argue, they're going to pass it out. Now, they suggested these wars, and we've seen this figure before, there's been $6.4 trillion spent. But it's, in a way, it's not spent, it isn't gone. The money was borrowed. You know, in this period of time, we've probably had the national debt go up more than that.
Yeah.
So we could argue the case that this $6.4 trillion is all borrowed money, so we still have to pay for the war. If somebody's going to pay for it, nobody's going to work hard enough to pay it off, but there will be a payment because that is debt is floating around there. And interest rates, although they're low, they can very well go up, and it's a big debt, and it's not on the people who declared the war. They're not even, I mean, we've made the point that people who are now old enough to fight in Afghanistan weren't even born when we decided to go in there. So these costs are hidden. For instance, the CIA is instrumental in a lot of most of this stuff. We don't even know exactly how much they spend. And then there's the supplemental budget, which comes on. Nobody even pays any attention to it. So there is tremendous expense. And of course, the other expenses that I think hardly anybody keeps track of is the pain and suffering that comes to the American citizen, the families at home, the divorces that occur, the people who have PSTD, you know, all these people, they suffer too, and just paying for this is going on, and it's all, I think, boils down to a deeply flawed foreign policy. And I'm going to make a suggestion I made before many times that could change all this. When somebody supposedly commits a terrorist attack against us, 9/11, something like that, the one thing that they never do is ask about the motive of why it was done. You know, in this day and age, when there's a shooting at a school, when 2, 10, 5, you know, no matter how many people killed, they even might have the person that did the shooting.
Yeah.
We have him in house, but we haven't figured out his motive. Why did he do it? Why is he doing it? Just think of all this stuff going on, but they never dare ask that question. And, you know, it may be they're scared to death about hearing the answer on what motivates individual. And that doesn't make them good people. It doesn't justify anything. But understanding it might be helpful in us understanding why we're perpetually under attack, and that people now are predicting. And if we don't change our policy, I predict it too. It's going to collapse for a long time until the big bankruptcy comes.
Yeah, one of the problems with looking for motive in this is because it forces Americans to look in the mirror, you know, our aggressive foreign policy. Oh, no, we don't want to attack them. Let's just have sanctions, right? Let's just kill a few thousand with sanctions. If we can put up that second tweet, not the first one, but the second one, this is a good illustration of where this money goes. These numbers are not just pulled out of thin air. Here's a pie chart, Dr. Paul. This is the cost of war project at Brown University. And if you look at this, the post-9/11 wars through 2020, you can see about $2 trillion went to the Department of Defense, $131 billion to state, almost a trillion to bases, to the base costs, $1 trillion on interest. That's something that you talked about, Dr. Paul. $1 trillion, another trillion for quote unquote Homeland Security, and then you're going to see that green one, Veterans Care. That's going to balloon in the future. So that's a breakdown of the costs. It's pretty terrifying. You know, the thing is, most Americans would look at this. The number is so astronomical, $4 trillion, that they may not even be able to compute. They may even think you guys are full of it because I haven't seen any costs, you know, but they're missing the point.
You know, something that goes closely along the lines of this terrorism being used as the excuse is the idea that everything that we do is couched in terms of patriotism. And patriotism, a powerful weapon. I don't think anybody wants to think badly of their country. I don't want to think badly of America. I get very annoyed at what our leaders do.
Yeah.
But very often people will use it against you, especially if they disagree with you. Oh, you're in the wrong country. We don't want you in Bolivia. We want you in Ukraine or something like that. And then they'll use this. You're not being patriotic. And of course, any suggestion that there's a lot of waste and fraud and useless wars going on, it's always couched in terms of patriot. But do they ever ask themselves, as we want them to ask themselves, and we ask the question all the time, where does the authority come? Where did you get the authority to commit these wars? Nobody's come here to start a war with us. They react to what we do, and this whole thing that all we have to do is turn off our sanctions, put on the sanctions, turn off their finances, and the people will revolt, and they will change their government, and everything will be okay. Hasn't worked, and that's been going on for a lot of years. It's costing too much. So hopefully the American people wake up and say, we want to change, but we want a real change in foreign policy.
And that's a good point, Dr. Paul, because you do have the covert wars of destabilization. These are in addition to all the wars that we're talking about today, and they cost a lot of money. Syria, Hong Kong, Iran, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ukraine, on it goes, the covert wars of destabilization that go on. And it also forces us to have the very strangest of bed partners. Al-Qaeda, we ally with them when it comes to Syria. We ally with some Nazi thugs in Ukraine to overthrow the government. In Bolivia, we're allying with a junta, a military junta that kicks out the elected government and says, now we control it. That's in the name of democracy. So we're undermining our own values, bankrupting us and killing millions of people. And what do we get for it, though? 20 years later, if we were totally safe and everything was fine and we were wealthier, then maybe you and I would be, out in the golf course or something. But what do we get for all that 20 years later? We're no safer than ever.
Not very much. About 30 years ago, so it's been a long time ago, there was a distant relative of mine that worked in an embassy, and he told me that the CIA is always around an embassy, and they knew the CIA was there. They were very much involved. But he said they were usually connected to some business firm. There was something going on, that they were representing and wanting certain things. But just think of Ukraine.
Yeah.
It's not like there was just one political party that was involved in that. They were just jealous over who was getting the gravy, I guess. I think that though there's been a lot of lying going on, I think that's been more on one side than the other. But we shouldn't be doing it, and then we wouldn't have to have these debates.
Yeah, and this is not the first time that we go in and liberate a country. Remember back in Yugoslavia, Albright's people went in and started with business. Wesley Clark's people went in and started with business. It always seems to happen that way. It goes back to Perkins, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, where a lot of these are for business. A couple of other things from the report. Boston University professor and co-author Anita Crawford wrote about trends. And these are also disturbing because we can point to their figures and they're pretty terrifying. But one of the things that she found, less transparency in reporting costs among government agencies. And I remember Trump told the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan, stop putting out those reports because they're too embarrassing when we spend, a couple $1 million on something that doesn't work. There's that. The war costs are being institutionalized within the budgets of the Pentagon and State Department. So no longer do you have, okay, here's our normal budget to run the Pentagon, and here's the warfighting budget. They're more and more being integrated, and so that hides the cost of wars from the American people. And the third one that she noticed is the increasing, and as we talk about the bubble, increasing costs of veterans' care. That's going to keep going up, I think. And so those are three pretty disturbing trends.
Well, there's one other side effect from all this that I frequently mention, but not too many seem to connect the two. And that is, in wartime, liberty is sacrificed more easily. The people, are willing to sacrifice some liberties for safety. And I heard that argument, during the 9/11 crisis. Oh, you've got to give up your liberties in order to be safe, and therefore we want them to do it. But the people right now don't realize, a lot of people don't realize that right after 9/11, I don't know how many weeks it was, but it wasn't. But the day afterwards, they knew exactly what bill was going to be passed.
Oh, yeah.
And it had been written years before we knew about 9/11. And therefore, I think the attack on liberty might be the most vicious of all attacks.
Yeah.
you can sustain debt and debt burdens and work it out and that sort of thing. But when you lose your liberty, you lose your power to speak out. And there is more censorship now, and it's so sophisticated with social media and all. And you think back through our history, I'll bet you all, from the very beginning there were wanting to curtail free speech. They certainly did it in the Civil War period, and then in the First World War they did. And they said, yeah, but this is wartime. And it's the excuse that people expect. But this is probably when you need it most. I think in the economic terms, that when you really need the free market is when you have shortages. But governments do the exact opposite. When you have shortages, they have rationing, and they get more involved and make everything worse. So this is what happens. They say, well, we don't want anybody bad-mouthing us because we're in a death struggle, and we don't want to be messed up with somebody telling the truth, or we can't handle all that. So we'll deal with that later on. Let the historians work it out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I'll just add one thing and then close, and that's, Dr. Paul, I'm sure you understand this too, the indirect cost. And here's just one example. I just happened upon this article just before we started, but doctors in the town of Fallujah, remember Fallujah in Iraq, they're battling, and they're not battling in war, they're battling in the costs and indirect costs of war. 30 new cases a month of children suffering from birth defects. Just in this one city in Iraq alone, uranium and other environmental pollutions are a prime source. But remember when we went in there so many times, we bombed the infrastructure, we bombed the sewage treatment plants, And so this is just an indirect. It's never going to end up in a report like this because there's so many times it's repeated, but it's not winning us any friends. And so I'm thinking the conclusion here is, what does it all add up to? It adds up to one word that encompasses the whole thing: bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy and the financial bankruptcy of our country. Which brings us again to Dr. Paul's wonderful new book. And you're going to laugh at this, Dr. Paul. My young daughter was sitting in the back of the car and we were driving home from church yesterday. We looked back there and she's reading the booklet. We said, what are you doing? She said, this is really interesting. I really like this. So for people of all ages, support the show, help us continue the show, and help us continue doing what we do at the Ron Paul Institute. With a tax-deductible donation of $50 or more, we're going to send you this booklet. If you send us $100 or more, Dr. Paul will hand sign the booklet. Just a way of thanking you for keeping us alive and keeping the message out of peace and prosperity. Dr. Paul?
Very good. And I just want to thank our viewers once again, as always, for tuning in and working with us, finding us new viewers and new supporters, because it's so necessary. And we are challenged at time right now. I worry about what it's going to be like in 5 or 10 years from now on how available the facilities that we use now, like the YouTube and different things, will be. It looks like they can close a person down in 1 day or two. So I don't think they can close us down, because I just don't believe ideas can be squelched. Matter of fact, sometimes when they try to, they become more apparent than ever before. But it's going to be a battle. It's the control of language. It's the control of speaking out against the deep state. It's a control against speaking out against government policies that we have to deal with. And I think that's why we have, a significant number of people that watches our program, because we do try to give people, a straight story on what's happening. And sometimes it's not all that easy, because sorting it out, and because everything you read and hear has to be analyzed at who's telling the truth. But one thing that I've learned over the years, if there's a headline now in almost any media, or if there's a piece of legislation like the Patriot Act, it's real easy to sort most of this out, because the headlines will tip you off. What they're saying is exactly opposite of the propaganda. So when they're talking about liberty, they're not talking about liberty. When they're talking about peace, they're not talking about peace. And therefore, it isn't hard to understand what peace and prosperity is all about and what liberty is all about. And if we narrow down the responsibility of the government to protecting liberty, free people can take care of themselves quite well. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.